I'm Matt Guichard, and this is No Holds Barred. In this episode, we're going to talk about restraining orders. Let's talk about restraining orders. There are a number of kinds of restraining orders, and I'm just going to read some information that any one of you can get online at the Superior Court in your county. There are domestic violence emergency ex parte restraining orders. There are remote access procedures for domestic violence restraining orders. There are applications for civil harassment and other restraining orders. And there are procedures for gun violence restraining orders. And that's just some of them. But let's really talk about how it works. A civil harassment restraining order. Let's say that neighbors are threatening each other. Somebody's dog comes over and uses a person's front lawn regularly. They get in fights, they get in arguments. And the person whose lawn has been violated says, I'm frightened. This person threatens me, brings the dog over, nothing I can do. And they go down to the courthouse and they get a civil restraining order and they fill it out. And that then is handed in. They have to go in person. And it goes back and is reviewed by a judge. And the judge determines at that very time whether or not to issue what's called a TRO, a temporary restraining order. And typically that lasts about 30 days or until the hearing that is set. And the hearing is set right at that time. It's important that the person who needs to be restrained is served with the restraining order. So that's part of the process. Somebody goes down and gets a restraining order. They fill it out. A judge looks at it and says, yes, indeed, I believe that there is going to be imminent harm, and I'm going to issue this TRO. That person then has to get a friend, colleague, process server to go serve the party they want to have restrained. Once that person is served, they get notice of the court date, and both parties are supposed to show up on that court date. At that time, the person seeking the restraining order is sworn, maybe brings witnesses, puts on evidence, and a judge decides whether or not to make that restraining order a permanent restraining order. In most cases, they last about 3 years, the restraining order. Some cases, 1 year. We've certainly seen 5-year restraining orders. That's kind of how the process works. I will say, however, it has to be imminent harm so that you're not going to ordinarily get a temporary restraining order when you go and apply. If something happened months ago and it's been eating at you, I'm afraid of this person, but nothing imminent has happened, you're probably not going to get that restraining order. So it has to be some imminent harm that you're going to face. So when I mentioned before about emergency domestic ex parte orders, and that is a person rushing down to get a restraining order because that harm is immediate, and it's immediate now, and I need that restraining order right now. It typically is still what we call a temporary restraining order because there hasn't been a hearing yet, and to provide the other party to give his or her side of the story. So I will say, oftentimes people threaten others and they get a restraining order because there's imminent harm and they're afraid. Look, I know that person has guns, that person's a big person, is threatened to come over and beat me up, and I need this restraining order to cause them to stop. The temporary restraining order will contain such things as no contact, don't email, don't call on the phone, don't have any contact with them whatsoever. And in many cases, they're neighbors. Well, there's a distance. So what if their neighbors and their apartments are right next to each other, and to get into their apartment, they have to be within 5 feet of when they get in? What if they go to the store and they see that person at the store? What do we advise them? Leave the store. Don't be caught in a situation, if you're the one being restrained, where somebody says, I saw them in the store. They followed me around. I was upset. You could be in violation of a restraining order. You could be subject to arrest. Something people don't understand about restraining orders and any kind of restraining order is if once that temporary restraining order in the state of California is issued, if you possess guns, and it says right in the papers that you're served with, you have to get rid of those guns. You cannot possess guns. You cannot have any guns in your household. Typically, you have to go to a licensed gun dealer. Now, many people just take them over to their parents' house or somewhere else. However, whether that's the right thing to do or not, doesn't matter. You can't possess guns under any circumstances, even facing a temporary restraining order. And if you're the person restraining, you're saying, well, that's certainly not fair. Once I get to trial, I'm going to be able to prove without question that I shouldn't be restrained, that the other person is just harassing me with this restraining order. Doesn't matter. Your gun has to go. In family law cases, in many cases, as part of the initial orders, there is a restraining order that you're not to harass, to call, to email, to do anything, to have any contact at all. And so we have a little bit of a confusion sometimes because we have a domestic violence court and a family law court and then perhaps a civil harassment court. Sometimes they don't speak to each other, and people in family law often say that I'm a victim of domestic violence and I should be in the domestic violence court with my restraining order. But in fact, here I'm in family law court and the judge here is working on different rules. Critically important, however, is a restraining order. Seek it if you truly believe you're going to suffer imminent harm. If you're on the other end of it and you truly believe you've absolutely done nothing wrong, you have not had any contact with this person, and they're doing this to harass you, retain counsel. Go to the hearing with counsel. Let them put on their restraining order hearing. I will say, in my experience, I often meet the parties out front. I try to talk to the counsel for the other party. Unfortunately, in most cases, restraining order, whether it's people seeking it or the people being restrained, don't have counsel. But many times I discuss with people that, do you want a judge controlling your life? Why don't you just step back from it, cease the conduct that you were engaged in, and you'll be much better off. And I'll tell you one of the repercussions. If in fact that temporary restraining order becomes permanent, in other words, for that 1 year, 3 years, or 5 years, that goes on your rap sheet. So what's a rap sheet? A CI&I. That means the State Department of Justice has a record, and that record is available when a police officer pulls you over, looks up on the screen, this person is subject of a personal conduct restraining order. And that perhaps may make a difference in how that peace officer treats the person who has that personal conduct restraining order. I'm not trying to say don't seek restraining orders, because it is a good vehicle in many cases to protect a person. The sad part is, as we often say, it is a piece of paper. And if a person served with that piece of paper doesn't abide by it, or becomes angry because they were served with a restraining order, in some cases that exacerbates the situation. It makes it worse. But don't for a minute believe that you shouldn't seek it if in fact you believe you're going to suffer domestic violence or have suffered domestic violence or civil harassment or for whatever. But certainly appreciate, go down to the self-help desk at the Superior Court and they'll answer all the questions that you need, and they will help to guide you through, both if you are the person seeking it and if you're the recipient. But it's very important, and it's part of our law. And of course, the law is designed to protect people. So that's why we have that situation. restraining orders. So that wraps up our initial discussion of restraining orders, just kind of an overview of restraining orders. In future episodes, we're going to drill down a little deeply into restraining orders, and specifically domestic violence restraining orders and other kinds of restraining orders that will be of interest to you. If you like the content of this episode, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. This really helps with the YouTube algorithm.